The real in Zurich, Trieste, Pula, Rome, and ultimately in Paris. He was a cosmopolitan in his living quarters, but returned inevitably to his roots and to the regional world of Dublin. He was educated in Jesuit schools and at University College Dublin, but left both nation and the Catholic Church to devote his life to literary art. Like Henry James, he spent his life devoted to literary art, and he wrote famous novels, perhaps the century's most famous, Ulysses, as well as the semi-autobiographical Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Finnegan's Wake. He's best known for his inventive and original use of language, his mastery of the stream of consciousness technique that was also used by writers like Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, his use of archetypes, myth, and what he called the epiphany, a word that he made famous. And what this represents is a moment of a revelation of truth for a character in a story. Both the use of myth and archetype and epiphany all are prominently used by Joyce in his classic masterpiece story, Araby, which is a tale of Irish poverty, the constriction of the Catholic Church, and a young boy's disillusionment with romantic idealism, the kinds of things we came to associate with the work of James Joyce. In the opening paragraph of Joyce, just to get a feel for him, of the story Araby, North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys and the mention of his chalice in the story evokes the Holy Grail. But what begins with the rush of feelings of romantic love turns into an initiation into a kind of darkness. It's not like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown, who was initiated into the dark woods of Calvinist horror, but it's a literal darkness, overshadowed by poverty and Catholicism and the boy's feelings of vanity. With his uncle's late arrival home, his journey to Araby began much later than he wanted or hoped for, and his epiphany at the bazaar is one of disillusionment as he faces a mercantile-minded salesgirl flirting. Romantic figure. Maybe that was part of the appeal of the unrequited love. And I tell this story because it really dovetails nicely with Joyce's figure in the story Araby. I remember being at her home, and she suddenly took a piece of spiral notebook paper out of her notebook and very casually just pressed her lips. She had that kind of thin lipstick that girls wore in that era. Pressed her lips onto the page, blotted her lipstick, in other words, and casually threw it into the wastebasket receptacle. Then she went out of the room a little bit after that, and I dove, at least that's how I remember it, went very quickly in to grasp this piece of paper to take it as some kind of a remembrance, as something that I could cleave to from her. This is exactly what goes on with the young boy in the story. That is, when she tells him about wanting to go to Araby, he cleaves to that whole idea of going to Araby for her, of making it his mission, of making it his raison d'etre, his reason for existence. And he finds stumbling blocks along the way. As I said, his uncle comes home late, lives with his uncle, and there isn't really necessarily a lot of money in this family, and so he's given a very little. The idea of the epiphany. Each of these stories has a different kind of epiphany. Let me get a little more into this term and what it means, because it's an important one. And people speak very casually about having an epiphany, like I had an epiphany, like the proverbial light bulb going over the head in a cartoon, or I had an idea that came to me. But it means something deeper than that. It usually means a realization that has a real illumination to it. In fact, it comes out of theology. It comes out of an ephemeral moment of spiritual-like revelation that's sudden and abrupt and can manifest itself in vulgarity of speech. By vulgarity, I mean the speech of the vulgate, the common person speech, just in a gesture, in a memorable expression of the mind. We experience it through the boy's enlightenment at the conclusion of the story. That is, we as readers experience it. But one of the things that makes Araby such a rich story is the boy is experiencing an epiphany as well. And the you have the serious religiosity of the Christian brothers in the school. On the other hand, you have the boy's wild, feral, romantic imagination, which wants to set him free, as the first paragraph suggests. The Christian brothers set them free because they're imprisoned in that world of repression, of religion. In fact, Magnan's sister is also very much devoted to religion. She wants to go to the bazaar, but it turns out that she can't go to the bazaar because there's a religious convent meeting that she has to attend. Early on, what we sense then in this story is all of this, call it institutional imprisonment. It's really a metaphor for their lives. It's as if the church casts a very big shadow, and you can see why Joyce was viewed as a heretic in his time, why he was viewed with a great deal of scorn and contempt, in fact, for taking such a strong, irreligious, and what was seen as very impious view of the power of the church over individual lives, over the romantic imagination of an adolescent. There is a former tenant in this story, we discover. The family's former tenant. Wasn't uncommon, in fact, for families to sublet or to have boarders, as they were called in the United States. And he left behind the romantic works of Sir Walter Scott, including a yellow-leaf memoir of Vidocq, and that's an escape from the isolated and musty life associated with another work which is left in his room, but with no one to inherit, the narrator tells us, a work called The Devout Communicant. And even in that back room, which is just mentioned, what he calls, at the end of the story, when he has his epiphany, his foolish blood. Nothing frivolous or worldly or tied to a lustful or romantic or love-seeking spirit can emerge from what is the nearly ubiquitous power of the church, or the drabness of the world of Dublin that Joyce gives us, or the decent homes, or even the streets which appear to be hostile to romance. Begin to realize that in Joyce a whole world opens up to you. It's Dublin, it's provincial, it's Irish, it's Catholic, but what he is allowing us to immerse ourselves in, what he is indeed immersing us into, is a boy's world on the one hand, but also the world of all these conflicting emotions, of the inner life and the outer life, of course, but deeper than that, of human longing and yearning. And we're looking at a time when indeed writers like Joyce were becoming more aware of the nature of repression and the nature of not only repression by institutions like the Catholic Church, but repressions that came from attempts to follow or abide by sometimes what seemed like devout or could be harsh morality. At one point, the boy's teacher's countenance, we're told, turns to sternness at the perception that he's becoming idle, thereby presumably inviting the mind to be the devil's playground, which of course is precisely the point, again, of this polarization, of this dichotomy. Because on the one hand, he's longing for, yearning for some kind of romantic love with Magnan's sister, a connection with her, a way to really receive her attention, idolizing her, and it's taking his mind away from being devout. It's taking his mind away from his studies. It's unrepressing him. It's, maybe you could say, liberating him. There is so much of the presence of the church in this story. The boy's aunt, for example, wants to make sure Araby is not some Freemason affair. Mrs. Mercer, character who's mentioned in the story, we're told collects stamps for some, quote, pious purpose. But here's a story that immerses us in modernism. And one can't separate the modernist movement from criticism of the church and other powerful institutions. Even in a poem like The Wasteland, written by the very serious Anglican T.S. Eliot, he talks, for example, about the unreal city, as Eliot does. And so there are writers who are bringing us into an awareness of the force of religion, taking more of a stance toward secularism, but also showing the kind of urban decay, the mechanization tied to the industrialism of the age, the unreal city, as Eliot calls really all the major cities of the world in the wasteland. The modernist view is also tied profoundly to disillusionment. Disillusionment with romanticism, and tied to the themes of waste and spiritual desolation that also run really quite strong in Joyce's story. And that's despite the fact that so much of the modernist view appeared soon after the First World War, and Araby and Dubliners appeared before it. The point of view in this story is rather complicated because it's that of a man looking back on his moment, adolescent disillusionment. And thus, Araby has the kind of modernist complexity of a point of view which is simultaneously both in the present and in the past. Well, that's true of Montrezor in Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. He's also looking back, but he does so to brag, to justify, even as he inadvertently exposes other parts of himself, unwillingly. This is different in Joyce. In Joyce, you have the epiphany. In Poe, there's no moment of self-realization or illumination for Montrezor, but in Joyce, there is. Now, is that moment of realization coming to the young man when he is an adolescent? Or is it coming from the perspective of an adult when he's remembering his adolescence? Or is it both? You could certainly make the case that it is indeed both. That he is experiencing this adolescent epiphany, which he's also allowing us to experience as an epiphany, but that also embedded in the story is the realization that this is an epiphany that comes with understanding at a later age as well. And so we have one of those moments in fiction where the past and the present coalesce, where they almost become fused one with the other, where there's a simultaneity of the past and the present being experienced through the narrative voice, through meanings, and goes back intertextually to things like the Bible. This story, after all, is a journey or a quest, and that takes us back in time to so many stories. It takes us back to knighthood quests, as I suggested, quest for the Grail. The boy in the story wants to follow his blood. He wants to move away from this repressive Catholic world of Dublin, to bring back something from the East, Araby, for Magnan's sister, the girl he believes he's in love with. Waiting and anticipating the journey, he keeps this image of Magnan's sister in front of him. It accompanies him, it obsesses him. And he imagines bearing a chalice through a throng of foes as he moves through the noisy, flaring Dublin streets of bargaining women, drunken men, cursing laborers, and the nascent violent politics reflected in the street singers' songs of the violent hero of the fight for Irish independence, Dynamite Rossa, whose real name was Jeremiah O'Donovan. So what's the meaning of concerned only with money? They have purchases to sell, they have items that they want to sell, and that's their job as they see it. They could care less about this boy, his errand, even his presence. Doesn't really affect them at all. They're gossiping and they're talking, and the boy is crushed at the end. Crushed by anguish, by anger, and by feeling derided by vanity. And the importance of vanity here is extraordinary because it's the real key to his feelings of defeat, since they tie so directly to the Catholic teachings, which he has not been tending to because of the summoning of his blood. Together. But you have to ask the question, how much of this young man's past intersects with his present as an adult? There's really every reason to believe, from all that we know of Joyce's early life, that the story has many autobiographical roots to it, and certainly it embodies Joyce's disillusion with the church and with organized religion, and the personal crisis he experienced of loss of faith, as well as his youthful disillusionment with romantic love. One can see in much of the dark short fiction that emerges a kind of reaction against the romanticism that came to be tied to poets like Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley. Though many of our short fiction writers implicitly champion the small and the seeming inconsequential, ordinary people, there's a definite sense of the lack of the kind of belief that many romantic writers had in the transformative powers of the individual. The story has an enduring power to it. There's no accident in the fact that the story is so often read and taught and anthologized. A lot of this has to do with its brevity, but it's also the epiphany and the impact on the reader, as well as the identification with loss that's tied to feelings of youthful folly and romanticism, and that are really based in a story which takes us from romantic idealization of youth to the crushing sense of the real and experience. We move through an initiation into the darkness of modernity. There's a famous play by Eugene O'Neill called Long Day's Journey into Night. No accident He's an Irish, though American playwright. In fact, O'Neill said, "You can understand me more through my Irishness than anything else." As he moves us from the light into the darkness, it's that kind of movement that we begin to see in the modernism that's reflected in Joyce's story. Goodman Brown finds darkness as well, in the forest and the heart of humankind. But it's linked to sin and to loss of faith. While in James Joyce, the specter of the morality of the church and the dingy and dark urban world of Dublin are what oppresses, while the heart of a young boy deeply, and we discover through him foolishly, craves the nourishing food of love and becomes, in his own heart, even if briefly, a knave rather than a knight. We move really more directly into the boy's inner life, as one might surmise occurs in Hawthorne with young Goodman Brown, but for the fact that Hawthorne is there to tell us what Goodman Brown is experiencing, whereas Joyce's young tortured Irish lad tells us in his own voice, and he makes us experience what he experiences. Less plot-bound than Poe or Hawthorne or Gogol or Maupassant or Henry James, Joyce provides us with a much richer inner life terrain, even as he takes us back in Araby to a kind of transfiguring and powerful sketch. Joyce's influence on the modern short story is inestimable. And he, along with the poet William Butler Yeats, whom many regard as the greatest poet of the 20th century, playwrights like Lady Gregory and Sean O'Casey, language is richly poetic. And yet it somehow manages to capture the inflation that youth can bring, as when the narrator says of this angel of his confused adoration, and think of the poetry in this, "My body was a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires." Araby combines two archetypal forms prevalent in fiction, initiation and the journey or mythic quest. Our next story is also an initiation story written by another one of the 20th century's great storytellers, the Russian Isaac Babel, who takes us into the world of war and violence, which